Joshua chapter 4. The people of Israel have just moved across the Jordan, which has dried up before them. And the priests had stood stock still in the middle of the river until everybody has gone past. But just before the waters start to roll back into place, Joshua tells them to do something. Here it is in verse 4. Joshua called together the 12 men he'd appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." He says, when they ask you, what do these stones mean? So Joshua was very careful to make this a shared memory. He got one man from each of the tribes of Israel. He said, you are all involved in this. You all have to know what do these stones mean. And they piled them up like one of those standing stones, one of those like Stonehenge type structures, and they were all involved in the bringing of the stones, in the building of the stones, and in the shared memory of what these stones mean. Well, what do they mean? Well, they were remembering a miracle. They were looking back. Remember, this is a history book, really. They were looking back on something that happened and saying, these stones remind us that God moved in miraculous power. This is a living memorial to God moving in the life of our people. So even when we are dust and bones, these stones will remain. So they're a shared memory of a remembered miracle. They're a milestone on the journey of the people of Israel. There was a day when God moved amazingly, and I will never forget it. And as he says in Deuteronomy, Moses says, tell these things to your children, bind them on your forehead and on your arms, remember them, remember that God moved, that there was a day of something astonishing happening, and you do well to go back to the memory of that day, to remember that if God moved that way in the past, he can move that way in your life now. That's the point. Because you see, you remember that the milestone is not the journey. The milestone, the memory, the signpost of where we have come from is not the whole journey. But it's not nothing. It's something, but it's a moment in the journey. We are all on a journey. We're all going through. And if I remember that in my past God moved miraculously, if I fail to remember, then I fail to understand the future correctly. If I misunderstand the past. It's a bit like a wedding. The wedding is not the marriage, is it? The wedding is a day of celebration, of the giving and receiving of vows, of promises made in a public place towards friends and relatives, of people who love you. And on that day, I remember when I made my vows, when I promised, I will be with you come hell or high water. No, that's not the word, is it? In sickness or in health, for richer or for poorer. And so you're remembering. Now the milestone of the wedding is not the journey. The journey is the whole marriage, the whole lifetime of partnership and trust and enjoying one another. But it's still important, isn't it? The giving and taking of rings, the covenant made. So this is what Joshua was doing when he said, what do these stones mean? They mean covenant. They mean memory. They mean the memory of miracle. It's a bit like your baptism. If you were baptized as a believer, I actually have the fortunate position of being christened as a baby and then some years later being baptized as an adult believer. So I was kind of covering my options maybe. But the point is this, that the baptism is not the Christian journey, but it's still very, very important because it's a milestone. It's a journey begun. It's the memory that God took all my sins away in the blood of Christ. very, very important, significant memory, but not the whole journey itself. So I need to go back to base camp. I remember hearing this story of a man who wrote down his testimony of how God dealt with him in his life, and when his pastor asked him to give his testimony, give his witness, give his account of God working, he said, just a minute, and he'd go home, go up into the attic and retrieve this piece of paper with his testimony written down, and then read the testimony. And all went well for a while, and then, but it was a little bit ponderous, a little bit dwelling in the past. I remember when God did this, and God did this, and God did this. And then one day his pastor said, will you give your testimony? He said, just a minute. He goes to his attic, and he said, oh, I'm sorry, the mice have eaten my testimony. Do you see that? I know it's a feeble joke, isn't it? Okay, but you see the point is that you have to keep your testimony up to date. You have to not dwell in the milestone, but dwell in the journey, at the same time as remembering everything that's happened. And of course, the wonderful thing about this little piece here is when it says, those stones are still here to this day. Verse 9 of chapter 4. The stones are still here to this day. We look at something that is still there. What do these stones mean? So what does it mean that God moved in your life? It means that he is a God of power. He is a God who is capable of dealing with every kind of problem in your life. He is a God who has dealt faithfully with you in the past. And if that is true, then that means he will deal faithfully with you in the future, that he can be trusted. You can relinquish control of your life. What do these stones mean? It means that God has moved, and therefore God will move. Amen. May God bless you this morning.